Namaskar, I'm Shubhendu Ghosh. Welcome to Global Scan. We get you all that made news across the world this week. US-China inch closer to a trade deal with a Hong Kong clause. Massive earthquake in Albania. How Algerians have rejected all 5 presidential candidates in the upcoming polls, and glittering celebrations of International Film Festival of India came to a conclusion. And also learn about heartbeat of a blue whale. All that and much more. Let's begin with the top stories. US President Donald Trump signs into law congressional legislation backing protesters in Hong Kong despite angry objections from Beijing. The new law will require the US to annually confirm that Hong Kong's special freedoms are being maintained by Beijing. Bolivia's interim president agrees to hold new presidential elections after a damning report from Organization of American States signs a legislation to annul contested election on October 20th. Death toll rises in quake-ravaged Albania. Earthquake of magnitude 6.4 killed dozens in the most powerful earthquake to rock Albania in decades. Newly elected President of Sri Lanka, Gotabaya Rajapaksa, visits India, receives ceremonial reception at Rashtrapati Bhavan, meets President Kovind and Prime Minister Narendra Modi. And a blue whale had its heartbeat taken for the first time ever. Whale's heart rate seesawed widely, pumping as many as 34 times per minute at the surface and as few as just 2 beats per minute at the deepest depths. Now first up, stories from the Americas. US President Donald Trump signed into law 2 bills supporting Hong Kong protesters this week. It aims to preserve Hong Kong's rights and autonomy. Alongside, US and China are trying to finalize the phase 1 of the crucial trade deal, but the US stance on Hong Kong have complicated the matters. China has threatened countermeasures if the US continue to what they call going down the wrong path.
It's a major relief for protesters in Hong Kong and a massive setback for Beijing. US President Donald Trump on Wednesday signed into law congressional legislation backing protesters in Hong Kong. The legislation approved unanimously by the US Senate and by all. But one member of the House of Representatives, the lower house, last week requires Hong Kong's special trade status with the US to be reviewed annually by the State Department. The law also threatens sanctions for human rights violations. From a business perspective, one of the most important elements of Hong Kong's special status has been that it is considered a separate customs and trading zone from China. The trade war tariffs don't apply to exports from Hong Kong. The bill also says the US should allow Hong Kong residents to obtain US visas even if they have been arrested from being a part of non-violent protest. Congress passed a second bill, which Trump also signed, banning the export to the Hong Kong police of crowd-controlled munitions, tear gas, pepper spray, rubber bullets, and stun guns. US President Donald Trump said in a statement, "I signed these bills out of respect for President Xi, China, and people of Hong Kong. They are being enacted in the hope that leaders and representatives of China and Hong Kong will be able to amicably settle their differences, leading to long-term peace and prosperity for all." But China's Ministry of Foreign Affairs issued a statement on Thursday expressing the utmost indignation and condemnation against the US President Donald Trump signing the so-called Hong Kong Human Rights and Democracy Act of 2019 into law. The statement said the signing of Act into law seriously interferes in Hong Kong affairs, seriously interferes in China's internal affairs, seriously violates international law and the basic norms of international relations, and is a naked hegemonic act. The Chinese government and people firmly oppose it. Beijing also summoned US ambassador to China to lodge stern representations and strong protest against US signing a Hong Kong-related act into law. Now all eyes on the trade negotiations between China and US following Beijing and Washington's disagreement over Hong Kong. Global Scan Desk, GD India.
The United States and China are locked in a bitter trade battle. The world's two largest economies have imposed tariffs on billions of dollars worth of one another's goods. US President Donald Trump declared on Tuesday that talks with China on the first phase of trade deal were near completion. Now let's take a look at the background to this much talked about US-China trade war and the potential deal that they're trying to work towards. And let's briefly take a look at what this trade war has been about and what are the connotations of the trade deal that the two major powers are trying to reach. We'll try and understand the different features of that. Let's understand the trade war first. It started how Donald Trump accused China of unfair trading practices. It said that in terms of intellectual rights also China has not been playing fair. There's been a greater deficit. The trade deficit between US and China has been tilted in favor of China. Meanwhile, China's position was that it believes that the US is trying to curb its rise after America, China being one of the largest economies in the world. So China perceives the idea of a trade war from that perspective. Now we'll understand what lied at the heart of this trade war, the trade deficit that lied between United States and China. A lofty US dollar 419 billion trade deficit in favor of China. If the trade balance was equal, the trade deficit would be zero, but hugely in favor of China it has been traditionally. In July 2018, that's last year, US imposes punitive tariffs on industrial goods from China. So that's where the cycle of imposing tariffs on each other's goods really begins. Beijing also retaliates with higher duties on US farm goods, agriculture products, something that US President Donald Trump had been particularly concerned about. So thus begins a cycle of retaliatory tariffs imposed by United States and China, goes into billions. Some figures show that US has imposed tariffs on $500 billion worth of Chinese goods, and China has done that on about $200 billion worth of American goods. So this cycle had started. This chain reaction or retaliatory tariff going into billions really. Even now, even as the first phase of the trade deal being negotiated, there are fears if it doesn't work out, there'll be more punitive tariffs. Now, uncertainty due to trade war hurts the global economy as well. Since last year, we've seen different measures, different ways in which this has shown an impact when two largest economies indulge in a trade war and the exports go down from both sides. It impacts the global trade as a whole. We saw how global stock markets also showed negative growth because of these developments. Now, US and Chinese negotiators have closed in on phase one of the trade deal. That's what US President Donald Trump spoke about. What is this phase one? Broadly, it contains US assurances of no additional tariffs, no further punitive tariffs against China, and also rollback of the existing ones which go into billions, as we mentioned. Also on the China side, Beijing has pledged billions in purchases of US farm goods. Remember, agriculture goods were the first set of goods where China had imposed punitive tariffs. All of this, in the middle of all of this, Hong Kong legislation by United States posing a direct challenge to Beijing's rule and authority in the region, its authority over Hong Kong as well. And China has condemned the United States' move on Hong Kong, but the trade war issue is a bigger issue for China to worry. Its economy is also getting stagnant. Economy and trade concerns are one of the bigger concerns for China. So it will be interesting to see how this entire tussle plays out between United States and China. We'll try and understand those parts as well. Moving on to some other stories from the Americas. President Donald Trump tore into the Democrats during a raucous rally in Sunrise, Florida on November 26th, accusing them of trying to rip our nation apart, I quote him, with their impeachment inquiry.
I think that people's opinions of the president are really pretty set. And I think for a lot of people who are supportive of the president, there really isn't much that he can do that would cause them to lose support of him. I mean, part of what's going on in American politics is this phenomenon of negative partisanship, in which whatever a person thinks about his or her preferred side, they're really motivated a lot by disliking the other side. And I think for a lot of Republicans, whatever the president may have done wrong, I think they're interpreting this as sort of an attack on the president and perhaps an attack on Republicans writ large, and they just don't want to stand for it.
For the first time in a while, I feel like the law is working the way that it should, and the system is working the way that it should. So it's a matter of, will the public pay attention enough for them to feel satisfied about the outcomes?
The U.S. House of Representatives Judiciary Committee on Tuesday invited Trump to its first impeachment hearing scheduled for December 4th, starting a new phase of the inquiry that could lead to formal charges against President within weeks. Now, Trump is not required to attend the hearing, but the move allows President Trump and his legal team access to congressional impeachment procedures that he and other Republicans have denounced as unfair, partly because the White House has not been able to call or cross-examine the witnesses. The House Intelligence Committee, which has led the impeachment investigation into Trump's dealings with Ukraine through weeks of closed-door testimony and televised hearing, is expected to release a formal evidence report shortly after lawmakers return to Congress on December 3rd from their Thanksgiving recess. Meanwhile, a White House official testified on Tuesday in the impeachment inquiry against President Donald Trump on Tuesday that the president's phone call urging Ukraine's leader to investigate Trump's political rival was improper and blasted what he called attacks on witnesses in the investigation. Army Lieutenant Colonel Alexandra Winman, the White House National Security Council's top Ukraine expert, also testified at the third public hearing in the impeachment effort before the House of Representatives Intelligence Committee. Amid power struggle in Bolivia, interim President Joaquin Anez signed a legislation to annul the contested elections on 20th October, paving way for a new vote as the Congress gave the green light for a new ballot without former President Evo Morales. The legislation had already been passed in both chambers of Bolivia's Congress before the interim president signed it. Meanwhile, the anti-government demonstrators lifted road blockades, pausing the months-long protest in Bolivia. Local media reported that road blockades in other regions had also been lifted as part of a pause in demonstrations. Let's now move to updates from Europe. European Union lawmakers gave final approval to German conservative Ursula von der Leyen on November 27 to take over at the helm of the bloc's Executive European Commission from December 1st. The vote in Strasbourg Parliament was 461 in favour, 157 against and 89 abstentions. Von der Leyen needed a simple majority to secure confirmation as the Commission President. Speaking at the Parliament's plenary session in Strasbourg ahead of the vote, von der Leyen placed emphasis on the need for comprehensive reforms to the EU and fighting climate change. Von der Leyen will be the first woman to hold EU's top job. 61-year-old former German defense minister who is succeeding Jean-Claude Juncker will face a full entree including economic reforms and migration as well as climate change issues. Meanwhile, British Prime Minister Boris Johnson denied that UK's National Health Service NHS would be on the table in a post-Brexit trade deal with the United States. Opposition Labour leader Jeremy Corbyn earlier on Wednesday revealed hundreds of pages of documents which he described as evidence that gives access to Britain's state-run health service that was being discussed in trade talks with the US. All the documents are dated from before Johnson took part in July. Johnson said the party was absolutely resolved that there will be no sale of the NHS and accused Corbyn of trying to divert attention away from Labour's anti-Semitism row.
This is a complete diversion that the NHS under no circumstances will be on the table for negotiation, for sale. Look at what we're doing with the NHS. We're funding it massively. And the reason we can fund it massively is because we believe as One Nation Conservatives, this is a new government with a new approach. We believe in putting big sums now into the NHS and sustainably for the future. But we also believe in driving the long-term growth of the UK economy. And that's why we're making sensible investments in such things as satellite technology, because those are the growth areas of the future. I want to see a dynamic, flourishing UK economy enabling us to fund the NHS for the long term. That's what this One Nation government is.
Remember, the NHS, much loved in Britain, has become a key battleground before a December 12th election, which Johnson called to try to break the deadlock in Parliament over the country's exit from the European Union. The governing Conservatives and Labour are offering very different visions for Britain, but both have pledged more funding for the NHS. Now, the most powerful earthquake in decades hit Albania's capital, Tirana, and the country's western and northern parts on Tuesday, tearing down buildings and burying residents under rubble. Several bodies were taken out of the rubble of collapsed buildings in the port city of Tiret and nearby Tumen, some 30 kilometers east of the capital. The European Mediterranean Seismological Center reported more than 30 tremors in the area between midnight and 10 a.m., including a powerful one in Bosnia-Herzegovina. The earthquake of magnitude 6.4 that killed dozens is said to be the most powerful earthquake to rock Albania in decades. Thousands of Albanians whose homes were destroyed or damaged in this earthquake sought shelter under tents erected by army outside football stadiums on the country's west coast. And now let's take stock of developments in Asia. Newly elected President of Sri Lanka, Gotabaya Rajapaksa, arrived in India on his first foreign visit after taking office. President Gotabaya received ceremonial reception at Rashtrapati Bhavan. He was received by President Ramnath Kovind and Prime Minister Narendra Modi. Sri Lankan president said that he would strive to take his country's bilateral relationship with India to a very high level.
During my tenure as the president, I want to bring the relationship between India and Sri Lanka into a very high level, and we have, of course, a long-standing friendship historically, culturally, and politically. And at the same time, we need to work together for the benefit of India as well as Sri Lanka and people of Sri Lanka, and on security as well as the economic development.
Prime Minister Narendra Modi and Sri Lankan President held talks at Hyderabad House in New Delhi. Both leaders discussed areas of cooperation and ways to strengthen the existing bilateral relations between the two countries. Earlier, Rajapaksa held talks with External Affairs Minister S. Jaishankar in the national capital. This is his first overseas visit after assuming office. A Bangladeshi court on Wednesday awarded death sentences to 7 members of an Islamist terrorist group, a verdict which was long awaited since 2016 when a terror attack in a cafe killed 22 people, mostly foreigners. Total 8 men were accused. The court acquitted 1 of them in the case, while the remaining 7 were convicted in the case. The public prosecutor, Ghulam Sarwar Khan, said after the verdict, the attack that took place in the evening of July 1st, 2016 at a cafe in an upmarket neighborhood in Bangladesh's capital was claimed by Islamic State and remains to be one of the worst terror attacks in the country. The casualties included 9 Italians, 7 Japanese, an American and an Indian. The following morning, after the 12-hour siege, police stormed the building and rescued 13 hostages. Family members and victims family of the victims gathered outside of the attack site waiting for some news. Moving on, Israel moved closer towards holding a third election in less than a year on Wednesday after Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's main challenger, Gantz, failed to form the government. Benny Gantz's announcement that he would not meet a midnight deadline following Netanyahu's own failure to put together a coalition in October deepened the political deadlock at a time of mounting security and economic concerns. There now begins a 21-day period in which Israeli lawmakers can nominate any one of the Knesset's 120 lawmakers to try and establish a coalition where others have failed. If that fails too, an election is triggered within 90 days, raising the prospect of a weary electorate going back to the polls after inconclusive votes in April and later again in September. Let's now move to news from Africa. Now, Algerians have rejected all 5 candidates running for president in the upcoming presidential elections in a fresh set of protest. Thousands of Algerians marched through the country's capital holding placards reading "No vote" and called for a complete cancellation of the upcoming elections on December 12th that they claim is packed with officials from the former military regime. The 5 presidential candidates were all senior officials under former President Abdelaziz Bouteflika, who stepped down in April when the army withdrew support after 6 weeks of demonstrations against his plans to seek another term. The protesters seek to replace the old guard of rulers from National Liberation Front who have wielded power since independence from France way back in 1962. They demand an end to corruption and withdrawal of the military from politics. Landslides have caused unusually heavy rains in Kenya's West Pokot County have killed at least 56 people. The downpour began on November 22nd in West Pokot Country, which borders Uganda, and worsened overnight. 4 bridges have been swept away and villages have been left inaccessible by road. According to local officials, unknown number of people have gone missing. Kenya is experiencing heavier than usual rain in the season. Researchers have warned that warming oceans are causing unpredictable weather patterns in East Africa. President Uhuru Kenyatta has deployed rescue personnel, including army and the police, to the region to try and prevent any further loss of lives. Now, French troops from BARC in operation mourned on November 27th their 13 fellow soldiers who were killed in helicopter collision in Mali. French Defense Minister Florence Parly and Military Chief of Staff François Lecointre arrived in Gao base to pay tributes to the fallen soldiers. France hopes to repatriate the soldiers' bodies in the days ahead. The soldiers were killed in Mali on Monday when 2 helicopters collided in dark after being called in to provide air support during a combat mission to track down a band of Islamic State militant fighters. The accident was biggest loss for the French troops in a single day since an attack in Beirut 36 years ago when 58 soldiers had died. And now we get you all the action from the world of sports. Spain's talisman Rafael Nadal beat Canadian Denis Shapovalov to win the Davis Cup and claim the team trophy for the 6th time. Nadal sealed the triumph, beating 20-year-old Denis Shapovalov 6-3, 7-6 to rack up his 8th victory across 8 matches, both singles and doubles during a grueling week. It was Nadal's 29th successive Davis Cup singles win. For Spain, it completed a remarkable week in the Spanish capital, which has been hosting a new version of the 119-year-old event featuring 18 nations. World Anti-Doping Agency or WADA recommended a 4-year ban on Russia for non-compliance in doping investigations. WADA's Compliance Review Committee suggested several sanctions because of the Russian Anti-Doping Agency's failure to cooperate fully during the probes into the Russian sport. The ban would threaten Russia's ability to host Euro 2020 football matches and its participation in the 2022 FIFA World Cup and the 2020 Olympics. Russia St. Petersburg is scheduled to host 3 Euro 2020 group games and a quarterfinal. Amid all this, Russian Sports Minister Pavel Kolobokov has said that recommendations were not the final decision and Russia had good chances to protect its athletes in further court hearings. In cricket, India annihilated Bangladesh in the iconic day-night test to win the first ever pink ball test match by an innings and 46 runs in 3 days and claimed the 2-match series 2-0 at the Eden Gardens in Kolkata. With this win, India became the first side in test history to register 4 consecutive victories by an innings. Having barely managed to avoid a defeat inside of 2 days, Bangladesh resumed at 152 for 6, hoping to score another 89 runs to avoid a second successive innings defeat. Bangladesh, which managed 106 runs in the first innings, could only muster 195 in the second, as India registered their 12th consecutive home series victory to consolidate their lead in the World Test Championship points table. And now, time for Cinema Scan, where we bring you all the buzz from the world of art, films and drama.
International Emmy for TV Movie Miniseries goes to Safe Harbor.
The International Emmy Awards, awards that recognize excellence in TV industry, started with Australian thriller series Safe Harbor bagging the award for the best mini-series, while the best drama went to British drama McMafia. Hungary took home its first ever Emmy Award with Marina Guerra picking up the Best Actress honour for her role in Orok Tel. The night's other top winners included Turkish actor Haluk Bilginer for his role in Sasiyet,
Dance or Die,
and the documentary Dance or Die from the Netherlands in the arts programming category.
Wow.
Pop sensation King of Pop Michael Jackson's story is headed for Hollywood from the producer who helped make hit film Bohemian Rhapsody, a film that won 5 Academy Awards in different categories. Producer Graham King has already secured the rights, including music, from Jackson's estate to make a feature film about the life of the Thriller singer.
Margherita?
The Golden Jubilee edition of the International Film Festival of India, or IFFI, closed on Thursday with Iranian movie Mark and Her Mother being screened as the closing movie.
My first time here, I feel honored.
IFFI is jackass.
The 9-day-long extravaganza saw a screening of around 200 movies from 76 countries. During the festival, over 30 master classes and in-conversation sessions were organized, which is the highest number ever. While the festival started with panache, the closing was also marked by an equally colorful and star-studded ceremony, with Ek Bharat Shresth Bharat being its central theme. Global Scan Desk, DD India.
And as we conclude this edition of Global Scan, we leave you with this image of the week. Scientists, for the first time, have been able to measure the heart rate of the world's largest creature, blue whale, and came away with insight about the renowned behemoth's physiology. The blue whale, which can reach up to 100 feet long and weigh up to 200 tons, lowers its heart rate as little as 2 beats per minute as it lunges under the ocean surface for food. The maximum heart rate they recorded was 37 beats per minute after air-breathing marine mammal returned to the surface from foraging dive. Take a look. Goodbye for now.
Oh gosh.
India.